Thank you, Dr. Markley, and to Dr. Smith as well, and to all of the distinguished board members who are in attendance, and most importantly to all of you. Thank y'all for having me here. I am subdued, trying to be composed. I got a suit on and everything, so I'm trying to be professional, but I'm really excited. Really excited, not just about today, but the prospect of continuing to work with you all throughout the duration of this year, and digging into Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, a great text that pulls together a lot of different works, a great synthesis of a lot of work from predecessors years prior, and combines with some very fact-based, brain-based research about how to improve learning outcomes for our students, which is why we're all here at the end of the day. It's about the young people. But also I just want to admonish you, and I just want to appreciate you for being in this profession. I actually believe that there has probably been no more important time in American history for educators to be in position than right now. And I want you all to take a moment to reflect on that. You are incredibly important, always have been, but probably no more than in this present moment do we need you. I say we because I'm a member of society, I'm an American citizen, but also I say we because I'm a parent of 4 children, 2 of whom are school-going age and go to traditional public schools. And so the charge that you have is incredibly important to folks like myself in helping us to chart a path forward for the state of our nation. And so I just want you to kind of take a moment to reflect on that and remember just who you are and why you're here. With the time allotted, I want to dig into a bunch of different concepts, and you know, it may feel as if these are disparate pieces, but I promise you that by the end I'm gonna hook this train up. Everything will come together in a meaningful way. And somebody might have to keep time on me because I got a little bit of preacher in me as well, so I can be a little long-winded. Sometimes preachers say, I won't be before you long. I'm not gonna lie to you today. I might be before you a little bit long, but hopefully I say something that's worthwhile. The title of my presentation today is Another Way is Possible. And I think that's important because to me, oftentimes when we look at our approach as educators, I always like to liken it to this picture right here. As an educator, this is messy work. It really is, and it's tantamount to sometimes being confronted with a puzzle, particularly if you're in leadership, school leadership, right? You have a roster full of children, right, who are enrolled in your school, and it's a lot like taking a bunch of pieces of a puzzle from a jigsaw, dumping it out on the table, and being told to assemble those pieces together in meaningful ways without getting the box. And that becomes difficult because if you're anything like me, or like any puzzle piecer together, if that's a word, you kind of start by saying, okay, what's the bigger picture here? What's the image that I'm supposed to be casting together? And you have to kind of, as an educator, you have to operate on the assumption of the belief that one is all of these pieces belong, that none of these pieces are errant, that they actually do belong here, that they are part of this picture. And 2, that despite some of the contours, despite some of the texture, despite the various colors, despite some of the ragged edges of those pieces, some are more opaque, right? You can't really tell if they're corner pieces or where they fit at. Some have jagged edges and rough pieces. Some are a little bit worn, don't necessarily fit as neatly and as nicely into place. But we have to operate based on the assumption that these pieces do in fact fit together, and we spend the duration of our year trying to find a way to make that happen. And so I hope that we can operate on the baseline assumption that when we're talking about our kids, that we do believe that all students belong here, that they belong in our schools, and that they have a place. And not only do they have a place, but that they should be included and feel included in a way that affirms their humanity, that affirms their identity, and ultimately places them in the best possible circumstance to not only survive educationally, but to thrive societally. So is that a fair assumption to make? I want to make sure that I don't proceed without getting some agreement. Are we on board? Good. This work is messy. The other thing is to adjust some what I would consider to be appropriate expectation. Because of the messy nature of this work, I just want to be clear that you're going to feel challenged, right? You're going to feel challenged. Whenever you talk about issues of race, issues of class, issues of gender identity, issues of ability, all of these things, if you belong to either historically marginalized or historically privileged, especially historically privileged or historically systemically advantaged groups, you're probably not going to leave the conversation feeling the warm fuzzies. Okay? And so I just want to put that out in the atmosphere. If you feel a sense of conviction or some discomfort, that's a side effect from these conversations. That lets you know that the medicine is working. Sometimes the medicine is nasty. It doesn't taste good, right? I'll try to make it as bubblegum flavored as I can, but at the end of the day, it's about it doing its job within the body, right? And so these are uncomfortable conversations, right? And they will oftentimes leave us pondering our own beliefs, pondering our own identity. You might get angry. And so I want to let that linger, because I think that that's to be expected. That's the territory of equity and inclusion work. But I also want to say that that's not the end point. Some folk in this equity space, they get up here and they say, you're going to be uncomfortable, like that's the destination. It's not, right? It's merely an impasse on our way to prosperity. Okay, it's something that we have to work through in order to get where we're going. And so long as we can commit to that and we adjust our expectations, and when we feel ourselves getting a little squirmy and feeling a little sensitive, that we acknowledge that we process that, but that we ultimately commit to this work, we have a real chance at changing our systems and changing our outcomes for young people. There's a couple of essential questions that I want you to think about in this vein of making yourself uncomfortable, right? And these are things that I just want you to kind of ponder on. You don't have to answer them for me, but I certainly want you to think about them to yourself and internalize them. And one is just on a personal level. People, or what are the root causes of poverty? And if you haven't taken the time to think about that, please do take a moment. Before you enter into this school year, take a moment to ponder for yourself, what are your views and what is your understanding of what causes poverty? Again, I don't need to know your answer to that, but these are, I think, guiding questions that will help to ground us as we proceed forward. Another question would be, what is the source of the racial achievement gap in education writ large? As school leaders, you've seen these things pronounced. Perhaps those who spent time in the classroom, you've seen them even as classroom teachers, right? But what's really behind that, right? Is it something that deals more inherently with the aptitude of students? Is it something that's structural? Is it a combination, a hybrid? Just, really pondering deeply on what you think is behind the racialized achievement gap. And then this fundamental question of, is teaching or is education political? Is teaching a political act? Or is it apolitical? Right? And what does that even mean to you when you start exploring these ideas? We often say that a lot. Like this work it's not political, right? Education is not political. We shouldn't be involving ourselves in these sorts of conversations. That has nothing to do with being able to run a school, right? Being able to facilitate teaching and learning, getting kids on and off buses, making sure the textbooks are accounted for, etc. But I just want you to entertain these ideas. And the final question, which I think is one of the big questions that we'll be chewing on probably for the rest of this year, is how do you think your teachers' responses to those questions might show up in their practice? Because ultimately, it's about the mental models that we carry in to our work, right? And so whether consciously or subconsciously, those things manifest themselves, but it might, after acknowledging that, be better for us to even question how and what ways might these things. Some of them might be more terranean, some of them might be more subterranean. But how do these things show up? And I ask those questions because in terms of equity and inclusion work, I really think that this is kind of the best place to start, to understand that there are 3 levels to how this thing operates. And from my vantage point, I've never seen anywhere, whether in the sphere of education or otherwise, when you delve into talking about equity, when you're deliberately talking about equalizing opportunity, fundamentally this work begins with the self, right? It would be a lot easier and the work would be a whole lot messy if folks could just produce a book that like gave you 15 tips for how to enact equity in the school, right? That would be a lot cleaner way of doing things, right? You just implement these 15 ideas and, you know, like a recipe, right? As long as the temperature is right and you're paying attention to the time, and that at the end the result should be equity. Unfortunately, that's not reality, right? It really does begin with us understanding ourselves, interrogating our own belief systems, our own understandings, locating ourselves within society, and really internalizing what are our beliefs, what are our baseline assumptions, and helping to increase our knowledge bases. Only then are we able to kind of look at our system, and as it stands, most of you are in charge of some system, right? Dr. Mark, you're in charge of the education system for New Hanover, but you all have microsystems that you're in charge of as well. And running a school, that is a system, right? It's a closed loop in some ways. And so how does, after interrogating yourself, how do you then impact your system? And then how does your system interact with larger society? These are the questions that have to be asked because, you know, the world is changing. Society is changing. And, you know, despite how we feel like this is a matter of fact, right? So on a scientific level, yes, I mean, we know that there's continental drift, right? That year after year, you know, the continents are slowly moving, right? The world is becoming smaller. When I was in undergraduate school, everybody was talking about this notion of the global village like it was some far off concept. Now that is an eminent reality. Right? Technology has facilitated new ways for us to connect and disseminate information on unprecedented levels. So now we can communicate thoughts and ideas at the speed of light. As a history teacher by vocation, this is what we talk about, right? Like the fact that years not so far ago, if somebody wanted to communicate some bright idea to the masses, they had to have access to some sort of medium. Right? So if you wanted to disseminate your ideas to everybody else, you had to, you know, you had to write it down, you had to write a book, and after you wrote the book, you had to find a publisher, or if you were like in TV, you had to be able to have access to a studio or a radio studio, right? And then, I mean, there was a certain level of capital that had to be given up front. But now individuals can simply look at their smartphones, which are essentially pocket computers, and within minutes, you can send messages that reach every corner of the earth in a matter of minutes. Social media has become a standard mode of communication. And in fact, it has actually become a medium that we interact even with the executive branch of our government. We expect to see statements made that are submitted through social media. And in a moment of anger or poor judgment, we can say or do things that we put out into the universe that cause people to judge us, right? That's kind of what led to some of the conversations that we had earlier, just, you know, because nobody wants to be the next famous school teacher, right, who ends up with a viral tweet or a viral story, right? Because the things we do in our classrooms, in our schools, they can be flooded throughout the World Wide Web in just a matter of moments. I say all this to say our world is ever changing and dynamic, and people are watching us. We have influence that we've never had before. Evolution is not just a theory about the origins of humanity, it's a factual description of the nature of life. I pay constant attention to the news cycles. I pay constant attention to the goings-on in Raleigh. As part of my being on the state board, I had to stay in tune with a lot of the policy discussions. That's my burden to bear. I wouldn't suggest that you immerse yourself in the way that I do because it can be somewhat depressing, frankly. But I do want to challenge you to do two things today. I want to challenge you to look at things differently. I want you to view all of the occurrences, the random, seemingly disassociated pieces of activity that are happening as not just part of a random puzzle, but as part of a pattern that if we're willing to pay attention, we'll start to see take actual shape. And the second thing I want to ask you to do is plead with you as educators not to be aloof. That is, don't be distant in your practice. Find ways as educators to respond to these changing times. Embrace change as the one constant and find ways to resist the temptation to view this profession as some distant, disconnected line of work where we're just here to teach content. I want to challenge you to look at that differently. Because unfortunately, whether we like it or not, all of these things up here influence your education outcomes. Am I right? Because I haven't looked at any of the data from any of your schools at all. But I know without looking at any of your schools that if I were to crack open your data, I know that race is going to be a salient factor in your education outcomes. Is that fair? Race is probably a factor in the composition of your schools, right? I'm certain that race is probably going to be demonstrated in some patterns of suspensions, right? In fact, it might even show up in some of your enrollment patterns. It probably is going to be under enrollment of gifted classes, honors classes, right along racial lines. I know that you're probably going to be struggling with finding teachers who look like the student populations that you're serving. I know all of these things without even looking at any of your data, because at the end of the day, these are not isolated trends. These are trends not just across North Carolina, but across the nation. We will talk about race because we're at a point in time now where the data demonstrate that race is relevant, right? And if it weren't, we would stop seeing these patterns. But because it isn't, because those patterns are so pernicious and so pronounced, we have a responsibility to address this in a real and intentional way, and to dislodge and decenter our own comfort to make sure we're responding to the lived realities of our students. I know that income is going to be a salient factor in looking at your school without even looking at your data. I know that if I were to look at the distribution of achievement based upon the income levels of your students, that you probably have a majority of students who are languishing, who many of whom are high poverty. Is that fair to say? I would venture to say that you probably have a pattern of behavior issues, right, with a lot of students who are experiencing poverty. Is that fair to say as well? And I just want to pause here also to say that hopefully we can agree on this fundamental assumption as well, that just because a student comes from a family that is not wealthy has no bearing on their level of intelligence. Is that fair to say? Is that okay? Do y'all believe that? Right. I don't know many of y'all very well, but I know some of y'all probably don't come from very affluent folks, right? But you know, your parents and your grandparents, how many of y'all know them were smart people, were they not? They were smart, savvy people who knew how to be responsible, knew how to raise children, knew how to maneuver, right? Even if they didn't have the formal education and stuff, these were smart folks. They were already endowed with the God-given ability to achieve. They had all the intellectual capital they needed. So if that's true about your folks, and that's true about our kids, and we can continue to see these disparate outcomes, then something else is going on that needs to be interrogated by us in meaningful ways. And English language learners, right? So language proficiency. I know at state level data that the graduation rates for English language learners are dismal, right? They're under 50%, right? And so just imagine, right, that you are someone who, you know, gets dropped off into an environment where you're proficient in one language, but the language you're proficient in is not the language of instruction. You're dropped off in this environment where every single class is in a language that you don't understand. And by the way, you're going to have to be tested at the end of the year. And those test scores are going to influence you all's outcomes, which, you know, have all sorts of other implications for you as school leaders, right? But ultimately, looking through the lens of those students like that, how frustrating of an environment must that be to exist in, right? What sort of interaction does that have with your level of identity? Do you feel like you belong in that environment? So there's a host of other things, right? Like, and these things, right? Like, we don't have access. As educators, we can't influence these things right here, right? So but we have to respond to them somehow, because they're going to show up and they're going to manifest themselves every single day in your school buildings. So you can't impact the birth weight of your students, but you know it matters. You don't determine whether or not they had access to pre-K, but you know that it matters. And so it's something that we have to be able to respond to and something we have to interrogate, okay? Because context matters. I'm biased when I say this because, again, as a social studies teacher, I'm always going to argue that you can no more take situations out of their societal context than you can take words out of literary context. Like, one of the worst things ever is to have somebody enter a conversation midstream where they weren't there from the beginning and then try to interject, and it's like, dude, you weren't here, you don't even know what we're talking about, right? That's not what we were discussing, right? They don't have the context. I feel the same way about us as educators when we truncate and try to respond to students just as they are. And sometimes we do things like that. We say, well, I just teach kids. I just treat all kids the same. But we have to fundamentally acknowledge that all kids are not the same. And one of the primary arguments for equity that I've heard stated was, if you treat unequally positioned children equally, in the end, what you'll have are unequals, right? So we can no longer use the convenient excuses of we kind of respond to kids all the same. We have to acknowledge that context matters. I'm gonna put a couple pictures up here where we talk about modern context, okay? Right. This is the context that not only do we live in, but that our students live in right now, right? We live in a context where hate crimes are on the rise, right? And not only have our students witnessed this, but in many cases, they may have experienced their own as well. This is the present context we find ourselves in, and how many of us have already been thinking about how we're going to respond to that reality, both with our students, but also with our staff. Are we building systems in our school buildings where we're finding ways to somehow react to this in proactive ways? Right? We have increasing immigrant student populations, and yet we know that anti-immigrant animus has increased. And however you feel about that, that's the present reality. That is the context in which we find ourselves. And again, going back to what are your baseline assumptions, what are your feelings, right? Free to feel and think however you are. You have freedom of thought, freedom of choice. But as educators, given those factors I talked about of our students, we have to find ways to respond to this in our schooling context, because when we close those doors, the other reality is not just setting out there, it's actually setting inside your classrooms. Right? An opioid crisis whereby North Carolina is one of the hotbed areas, right? Students and families who are dealing with a persistent drug crisis and the ways that wreaks havoc on families. Have we thought about, in our present circumstance, how we're going to respond to this imminent reality in our classrooms and in our school buildings? Because again, this is going to determine or impact students' readiness. Again, not their intellectual ability, but their readiness to come to school and learn, right? And their behavior, perhaps, and how we internalize and how we respond to that, how we interpret that. Have we considered these contexts, right? The fact that for many of our students, they're going to be dealing with coming off a summer where there have been persistent ICE raids. Again, feeling however you want to feel about that, I will put the caveat out there that the Supreme Court has already settled versus Doe 1982 that it does not matter how a student comes to us, that the public school system has a responsibility to offer a public education to everybody. So that part has nothing to do with your feelings or our feelings, right? Well, in the spirit of being law-abiding and law and order, it is our responsibility to offer a quality education to all students, whether they are documented or not. But that's worth an applause. But this is something that I wonder if us as educators have even internalized, that our students, many of whom themselves may be undocumented or be in mixed status households where maybe they're documented but their parents or relatives are not, are living under this persistent fear, and the trauma that has and the ways that manifests itself and students' readiness to learn. Have we really thought deeply about that? Context matters. Or the fact that you have kids of color, right, who persistently see media images such as this where folks who look like them are disproportionately on the receiving end of extreme use of force by law enforcement for many a times what are citable infractions. This particular individual a couple days ago was selling water without a permit in Las Vegas, teenage boy, right? This is going to impact the ways that our students show up. And far be it from us, matter of fact, shame on us. Shame on us if we don't take the time to deliberately interrogate our own feelings, but again, decentering ourselves and making sure that we create school environments that are responsive to this reality. Historical matters, right? I'll always bring this up when I come to Wilmington because Wilmington is the only place where a successful coup has ever been launched in the United States. And words matter too because we have heard it phrased differently. We have heard that there were race riots or uprisings, when the fact of the matter is it was a coup. It was a coup d'etat. A government, a multiracial government was dislodged simply because of white supremacy. Right? And then we have to deal with just the structure of our institution altogether. Right? This notion that schools are still a relatively new institution that is evolving, that if we're being honest with ourselves, there's never been equity. And the original model of schools was really about order and efficiency, right? So as territories industrialized and mills and factories that were popping up, really what it was about is finding what to do with young people during those times where they could be involved in some sort of productive activity. But a lot of it was not about offering a truly emancipatory or liberatory education as much as it was about preparing them to be able to work. And a lot of times it was unskilled labor. These schools were created in the image of primarily white, male, Christian, particularly Protestant students. And if that's the archetype that schools were built around, do we think that that historical legacy still shows up in our schools now? But think about our student population. Do they reflect that archetype now? Maybe, just maybe, that has something to do with the systemic problems that we continue to see. There was a time not long ago where the prospect of allowing women to go to school was revolutionary. It was thought that if you allowed women to go to school, that you were ruining potentially good housewives. Beyond that, and there are really papers written about this, that they would emasculate, that this would emasculate men. Can you imagine that? Because now you have a housewife who potentially knows more than the husband, and what good is that, right? Now he's going to lose every argument. We lose every argument anyway, right? But now, you know, with education, this is going to disrupt the traditional sense of the family, right? And so even when we allow women and girls to start going to school, it's under this idea of domestic feminism, that the reason why to allow women to go to school is because they're going to raise our babies, and we want our babies to be educated. So that's why women should learn to go to school. These primitive ideas about education are embedded in our systems. No wonder we have underrepresentation of girls in STEM when this is our historical reality as an institution. Okay? We oftentimes wonder why different racial groups don't come to school, or school's not a place of imagination or fun. It's because for some student populations, their group membership dictates a different experience. John Dewey talks about experience in education, and that when we speak about experience, we can't speak about that in singular terms, because every group has a different experience with education. If you're talking about Native people, First Nations folk, they have a different experience with schools. Schools are actually sometimes sites of trauma, right? And so that will impact the relationship that you have with those who are in authority over you. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes rooted in a historical context whereby, you know, schools were structures and mechanisms of domination, right? Where you were told to abandon your cultural norms and to assimilate into the dominant society, dominant. Again, I told you who schools were normed after, right? This impacts the ways in which communities come to us, the way they show up. And we have to be willing to acknowledge this reality if we're really going to be able to equalize education and talk about responding and differentiating the ways that we deliver education. It's important to acknowledge this reality. I think about the residential schools, right? The fact that the impetus, according to Carlyle, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. A really, a barbaric concept. But I wonder sometimes, even in schools now, if we're not trying to do the same thing. Maybe less malicious, but are we killing the imagination, right? Are we killing the identity of our students, right? To make them conform to this ideal? We know pretty well about the experience of African Americans down south when it comes to school, right? That initially, for black folk, they weren't even permitted to learn, right? That in North Carolina in 1831, when they passed black codes, it was illegal to teach a black person how to read. That it was punishable by lashes, and it was thought that education ruined a good slave hand, right? Because even in that, there's the acknowledgement that education isn't in and of itself emancipatory when it's done right, right? That it's abolitionist when it's done right, all right? But even after that, right, the Reconstruction, right, there's this separate but equal way of doing things where we're offering people deliberately inferior experiences. And what's interesting about that is all across North Carolina and furthermore the nation, schools are resegregating across both racial and social economic lines. Right? And we ask ourselves, why is that? Well, again, you can't pluck things out of their context. Right? You have to put things in their appropriate environment. And we oftentimes talk about Brown versus Board, but did you know that Brown versus Board was actually precipitated by a court case that actually was the historical precedent for Brown versus Board, called Mendez versus Westminster, where it was actually Mexican-American students in a family out west who protested separate schools for Mexican families versus white families. And parents at that time, the Mendez family, who recognized that this was wrong and protested the ability for their students to go to school. So when we think about our Latinx students, who experienced there as well. And how many of us really even knew about this? Like, I didn't find out about this in my teacher prep program, so I'm gonna be honest here, right? I had to figure this stuff out on my own level of research. So how is it we're going into the field and responding to this population and we haven't been given this education? So the truth of the matter is this context is important and we get a lot of the blame as educators. But my argument is we actually haven't been supported enough to be able to support the student populations that we're now in front of. And so that's why it's important for us to have initiatives like these and to be able to say, we're going to spend the year working on this because we know we need to upskill ourselves. We know that we have to do something differently. We have to put ourselves on a trajectory to help change our state. Because this is the new America, right? America is changing, and in some ways, it has changed. Our demographics have drastically shifted. America looks way different than it did 50 years ago, than it even did 20 years ago. North Carolina kind of as one of the prime examples of that. And if we're being entirely honest, everybody's not happy about that. Can we just put that out there? I think I just did, okay? Just gonna put it out there, right? Everybody's not happy about that. And in fact, I think that recoiling and resistance to this change is really, at this point, irrevocable. I don't care what anybody says, right? It's what's animating a lot of the environment that we find ourselves in. It's no less a fact that America is becoming more, infinitely more racially, culturally, religiously, and linguistically diverse. As a consequence of that, and as a consequence of us being seen as the greatest country in the world, it should be no small wonder that everybody wants to come here. So we have an increasingly large foreign-born population in the United States of America that makes the American tapestry more beautiful, in my opinion, but it also makes it very different. These things are not unimportant factors for educators. Because as society goes, so goes our schools. These things have educational implications that we, for the first time in public education's history, the majority of students in our education system are students of color. And despite the wealth of our nation, the majority of our public school children in America are either experiencing or near experiencing poverty. We have an increasing student population for whom English is not their native language. So the question we have to ask is, what are we to do about this and how do we feel about this? Well, I'm going to tell you that we have a responsibility to respond to it. And here's why it matters. Because we have to ask ourselves, is this important enough for us to do something? I was on a plane with a guy as I was going to Singapore to study schools there. And he was not going to Singapore for that. He was going to someplace in Southeast Asia. And we were on a 20-hour flight that we boarded in Chicago. And because I knew we had a long time to sit down with each other, I decided to strike up a conversation with him, make small talk. And so he was asking me, you know, where am I going, what was I going for? And I explained to him about, you know, I was going to Singapore, check out the school. He's like, great. So then I reversed the conversation. I said, so where are you going? He said he was going somewhere in Southeast Asia. I said, for what? He said, oh, just to do good stuff. Ever the teacher, I was like, started probing. I was like, can you expound on that a little more? Tell me more. What does that mean to do good stuff? And then he said, well, to do missions. I said, great. Let it be silent for a little while. And then I was like, that doesn't make sense to me. What do you mean? I mean, are you going to build wells? Are you going to, you know, erect a school? Are you going to like distribute vaccines? Like, what are you doing? Eventually got him to admit that he was really, you know, just going to provide relief for missionaries who were already over there. And after that, I let him loose, and I decided to let him next 19 hours of the flight. But I say all that to say is that it's incredibly important for us to ask the same questions. I don't blame him, because I don't think many of us have really taken time to interrogate or revisit our education philosophy. Why are we doing this? Right? Ultimately, I think we're similar to he in that we're just hoping that we're doing good stuff, that we're giving back, right? But why is this work important? Why is equity important? Right? Because for me, speaking personally, I recognize that all these systems rob young people of their potential. And furthermore, it robs us as a society of their gifts and of their talents. And so for me, education is the best way to subvert and undermine an otherwise broken system and allow young people to become their full, emancipated, developed selves. That's why we're doing this. But we have to ask ourselves a similar question about education and about why we're here. What is your underlying motivation here? And when you explore that, it's going to cause you to inherently get political. And I know we like to think, oh, education is not political and this, that, and the third, you know, but listen, I got to tell you, I don't agree with that at all. You can feel free to disagree. Disagreement is healthy. And, you know, if you disagree, I would agree with you, but then we both be wrong. Education is not free of political influence, despite our best efforts. Everything down to the textbooks that you use, to the curriculum that's implemented, to the students that are assigned to your school, to the resources that are available, to the folks that serve on the Board of Education is influenced by some sort of democratic process that involves politics. I would agree that it's not partisan, right? Because I don't fit anywhere neatly on any of that stuff. But it is inherently political in that it involves politics and policies, okay? So us, when we acknowledge context, we have to throw off this idea that education is not political. And if you can disagree with that, that's fine. But I submit to you Socrates. And you think education is not political, any of folks who are history teachers, what was Socrates' fate? He was executed, right? For what? For allegedly corrupting the youth, right? When you really start digging into this work, it's going to upset some people, right? And there's a historical legacy that shows that that is so. And so as much as we like to use Socratic methods, you know, Socratic seminars, are we really evoking the spirit of Socrates when we approach education? I love this quote from Marco Rubio, okay? The 2016 Republican debate, right? He says, I'm not interested in being politically correct. I'm interested in being factually correct, right? Because whereas these things are inherently political, I don't really care about political correctness either. I don't want us to use that as an excuse. Oh, well, society, no, we just can't, we got to be politically correct. I feel like that is an excuse, and that is a load, and we need to relinquish ourselves of that load. And we need to say, we're going to have to interrogate these issues, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about facts. It's not about feelings, right? Factually, these things matter. They show up in our outcomes. Factually, these things are the present context. Factually, as a institution of education, this is our charge, and so we're going to have to get down to the nitty-gritty. It's not about politics to me as much as it's about these two fundamental concepts, democracy and humanism. How many of y'all know what this building is? Oh, my Lord. The civics guy in me is about to go crazy. Thank you. Oh, I was dying. This is the outside of the Supreme Court. Right? Emblazoned on the outside of our nation's Supreme Court says equal justice under the law. The notion that no matter who you are in this country, that when it comes to the eyes of the law, you will not receive special treatment. That nobody is above the law, that we all will have to wrangle with and deal with the system of justice eventually in a way that is proportionate to our crimes in this instance, right? That justice is our pursuit. When we start thinking about things like this, we start talking about equity, inclusion, and justice, suddenly we realize these are not social justice-y left-wing things anymore. These are things that speak to democratic ideals. They are not partisan. Right? They are democratic at the end of the day. These are things that we all as American citizens signed up for, that we all pledge allegiance to. Right? When we look at the preamble to our Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide the common defense, promote general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty, for ourselves, for our posterity, to ordain and establish a Constitution for the United States of America. Justice, common defense, general welfare. Right? We start talking about these things, we all retreat to our poles on the political spectrum, but this is the preamble to our Constitution. I'm submitting to you that the excuse that these things are partisan one way or the other, that they're left or right, that they're Democrat or Republican, is nonsense. And we have to free ourselves of this dichotomy, right? That when we start talking about doing right by all of our kids, enacting a level of justice, a level of fairness, a level of care, equal opportunity, that these are things that are much more transcendent, that they are larger than that these are American ideals that our institution has failed to fully capture and in some cases allowed to go by the wayside. This is what we're rooted and grounded in, is concepts such as this. And furthermore, it's about humanity. The fact that we want all of our young people to reach their full development as human beings, that in a democracy where we're supposed to be self-governing and sharing power with one another, that requires us to be able to interact with and engage with people across lines of difference. That no matter who you are, whether you're rich, poor, whether you're a person of color, regardless of what your ability is, that at the end of the day in a democracy that you have just as much power as I do. And so that requires me to deal with you. That's what equity is about. Right? That's what we're really talking about when we talk about inclusion. As I get ready to close, I want to mention that I know that there are things that are discouraging us from tackling these things, and I think the ed reform movement is a part of that. Listen. There are plenty of things that discourage educators from taking on these challenges because at the end of the day, you ought to be held accountable for your outcomes, right? I know that, your outcomes and, EOC, EOG scores and your growth and EVOS data, that's what folks are going to judge you by, right? That your schools and how they perform impacts the economy, it impacts the real estate development and all these other things. And so folks aren't necessarily concerned with the things that I just talked about. Now, those aren't the things that animate most of the conversations. They're about whether you're A school or a B school or D or F and what's the reason behind that, right? That it's about holding you accountable for those outcomes. So I want to acknowledge that and put that out in a space that I know that folks aren't very sympathetic to the stuff that I'm talking about. This feels very good and feels very convincing and convicting, but the present environment doesn't really care about that. They care about, whether their child can, graduate with honors and be able to go into a school and things of that nature. But every system is designed to achieve whatever it is achieving. And so if we look at our schools and what we're putting out, we have to deal with the design. And a deeper question for us might be to ask, is it a design flaw? Is it something we're just not seeing or not paying attention to? Or is it a feature? Is it inherent to the way we're operating? Right? Is it built into our structures? So I'm going to proceed here. I was going to play a video, but I'm choosing not to because I want to get to a couple of solution-based items. This is a really good book that I think you should read. It's not required reading, but I think it deals with larger systems. And there's a guy by the name of Ta-Nehisi Coates who wrote a book called Between the World and Me. And this book is written from the perspective of an African-American man who grew up in Baltimore and talking to his son about what it is to grow up in America as an African-American man, right? His identity. This book it evokes a lot of emotions on a lot of different levels, but I felt like it's particularly jarring when you look at education systems. It's not about education, but he talks about us a lot. And he says this about the education system. He says, I came to see the streets and the schools as arms of the same beast. One enjoyed the official power of the state while the other enjoyed its implicit sanction. But fear and violence were the weaponry of both. Fail in the streets and the crews would catch you slipping and take your body. Fail in the schools and you would be suspended and sent back to those same streets where they would take your body. And I began to see these two arms in relation to the street, fail in relation to each other in the streets. Those who failed in the schools justified the destruction of the streets, and society could then say he should have stayed in school and then wash their hands of him. There's a dynamic relationship there. And if we just focus on outcomes and outputs and education, what happens is we won't evoke the larger critical thinking, right? The larger societal, helping our students to grapple with the larger societal questions, right? We ought to make sure that our students are just as adept at solving social issues and social crises as they are mathematical and scientific ones, because if we don't, then we are on pace to run into what Dr. King phrases as this: our scientific power has or will outrun our spiritual power, where we will have guided missiles and misguided men. If we're just focused on the outputs and on the calculations and the content, we won't deal with how and what kind of people that we're erecting as a society. And so I want to submit to you this idea in closing of radical imagination. Radical imagination is a theoretical framework. It's been written about, talked about, that basically looks at all of the context that I laid out. It acknowledges that it is depressing. It acknowledges that it is inherently dysfunctional. It acknowledges that it is really, really, really bad. But what radical imagination does on the back end of that is it says, in some cases, the most revolutionary thing you can do, the most tangible act of resistance, is to imagine that another way is possible. This is not some pie in the sky, aloof attempt to ignore the present conditions. What it does say is, you know what, sometimes the most you can do is hold on hope that there's something else that we can do, that we can perhaps construct systems that do not look like what I just talked about, that ask the question that what does it look like to build a school system whereby children can come to school from all their various different realities and lived experiences and come into our school buildings and feel affirmed? How do we create a space that helps to critique and to analyze our histories, to deal with the more inglorious aspects of our past and of our present, and yet charge and inspire our students to use education as a tool of freedom? How do we find ways to interrogate some of the more persistent problems of racism, of classism, of sexism, of ableism in our schools? To actually use our schools to construct a different reality, that's the radical imagination. And it's rooted in the lived experience of other folks. I just returned from Ghana, West Africa, from being there for 3 weeks. Some of you all may have gathered I'm African American. I know, it's a surprise. But I went to Ghana for a host of different reasons, but one was because 2019 marks the 400th year since the first enslaved Africans were taken to the United States of America in Jamestown, okay? And many of those, not all of them, came through Ghana, West Africa, and the slave fortresses that were there. And so I went there. I went to many of the historical sites. I walked and set foot into the slave castles. I touched the walls, the dungeons where they held men and women cramped and packed spaces where the air was so thick you could hardly breathe, where the guide forced you to imagine an environment with human beings being in these spaces, shackled, mistreated. And I thought about that environment. And I thought to myself, what would make these people believe that they should stay alive long enough to experience a different reality? Because they had no idea what they were going to experience. And then there was this door called the door of no return, whereby when they would get on the boats, they were taken across the Atlantic. Most, probably 2/3 of them, did not make it. Let alone the next 250 years of enslavement and then 100 years of segregation they would experience. What would make anybody want to stay alive in that environment? And it dawned on me that it was this idea, this notion of radical imagination, that despite the fact that I cannot see a present way forward in my lifetime, I'm going to hold out hope that another way is possible. And so my return there symbolized that they were right. That my ancestors probably had no idea whether or not they would live through that experience or their offspring, but here I am making the full circle return because of that radical imagination. Now, how about us adopting something similar as educators and changing the way that our systems operate, the way that they look from the inside out? We know what they look like. We know how they evolve. We know what they do to our kids. But what if we took a similar spirit into our work? How much different would our America be? How much different would our society function if we were successful? How much more tranquil would our domestic body be if we took that similar spirit? So I'll leave you with a couple of points. The way to do that, in my estimation, is one is to get proximate to these issues. We can't be aloof. You got to dig in. And I said from the outset, it's going to get messy. You're going to get in your feelings. Right? You're going to be challenged, right? You're going to see things you don't like. It's going to force you to face some stuff that, and question, have to confront some baseline assumptions. But we can't do it unless we get proximate. And even when you're in your school building, understand that there are things that are happening that you may not be seeing, or that may be covered up by some of the data, where the layers have to get pulled back for you to really see the phenomena that are taking place. We got to get proximate to the issues. This is part of how we get there. 2 is focusing on systems and not symptoms. A lot of times we like to penalize the kids, and in some cases our staff. But as I said from the outset, a lot of teachers, man, they don't mean no harm. Some of them do. Most of them don't. Most of them don't mean no harm. They're doing the best they can with the knowledge and the training they've been given. The fact is they've been failed by a system that has not prepared them to teach the kids that they're dealing with now. And they have the best of intentions oftentimes, and it still ends up producing the same outcomes. So the way that we respond to that is by being hard on the systems and softer on the people. It's not saying we let folks off the hook. Folks still got to be held accountable. When we recognize that ultimately what we're seeing is a symptom of a greater problem, then we got to focus our attention on the system. It can't be made to be about individuals, and I know you could argue that systems are made of people. I agree. But at the end of the day, we're focusing on how the system operates, and yes, that does implicate individuals, but that should be our focus. Focusing on the systems instead of the symptoms of the greater problems that exist in our school system. Using an asset-based frame. So oftentimes when we talk about our kids, we use language that is deficit. And by deficit, what I mean is we're so focused on what they don't have. I've heard it phrased that we focus on our students on their debits rather than their credits. And the truth of the matter is they come to us with a little bit of both. A student may not have both parents in the household, but they come to you with something, right? A student may come from an environment where there may be drug abuse or drug distribution, right? They themselves might be engaged in illegal activity, right? And so I always like to say, well, shoot, like, there's some things that you can work with there. There are some assets that we can look at. I mean, taking all the judgment out of it, I had students who sell drugs, right? That's wrong. We should acknowledge that. Don't sell drugs, kids, okay? But I always thought to myself, like, well, what are the qualities, again, taking all the moral implications out, what are some of the qualities that a student who sells drugs already has that probably aren't being acknowledged? They understand markets, right? They understand market forces. They understand supply, demand, distribution, logistics, right? Market share, profitability, right? So maybe there's some things that can be worked with here, some assets that come along with them, right? The students aren't just English language learners, that they're proficient in another language, right? So figuring out ways to capitalize on the funds of knowledge that your students bring to you and not looking at them purely through the lens of the deficits is important. And lastly, and this is the one that I'll end on, committing to lead with love. Committing to lead with love. I want to qualify that. Because oftentimes when we talk about love, I'm not talking about some hippy-dippy, peace signs and like sunflowers and Volkswagens. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm literally talking about a revolutionary love where we love each other enough to hold each other accountable. Where you love each other enough where when you are held accountable and you get called out and you get upset, that we love each other enough to deal with our stuff and to still come back and to still engage. That we love each other enough that we're willing to deal with the discomfort and work through the discomfort to get here because we owe it to each other and we owe it to our kids. My colleague, I'll give her credit here, she often likes to say, we don't love each other enough to do this work. We're not willing to go through the tough parts with each other. I don't love you enough to have you reflect back to me something that makes me feel uncomfortable, that makes me feel a sense of shame and guilt, to hear what you have to say and then have to go and engage you. I don't love you enough to do that. I would prefer to just disembark and dislodge. And furthermore, do we love our kids enough? Do we love our kids enough do we care about them enough that we're willing to confront our own biases, deal with our own stuff, confront our own worldviews about how society is organized to give them a chance to be successful? Do we love them enough to do that? And I would submit to you all that if any of us can't say that we love our young people enough to do this, then we should find another line of work. We have to lead with love, right? And some of that is tough love, right? And some of that is gracious. And it requires a combination of both of those things. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and end, going the wrong way. And with this picture right here. To you, this looks like a messed up drawing. To me, this symbolizes what we truly want, and that is, are we truly allowing our young people to color outside the lines? Do they truly have the freedom to be their whole selves, to not abide by the constructs and the confines that the systems have created for them? And are we making it our charge as leaders to allow them to really be themselves with all their colors, all of their various directions and angles and uniqueness, to color outside the lines and to enjoy their identity, to enjoy this experience, and to enjoy the freedom that is promised them as a member of this great republic? So I thank you all for listening, and I'll leave my contact information up here.